All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about our research on the environmental impacts of manufacturing aquaculture feed. As Sarah said, I'm Spencer. I'll be talking about how we calculated this and just a little bit more context in addition to our research. I'll just say that the interface here kind of covers up the Zoom one. So if you can't hear me or anything at any point, please just interrupt. So to clarify briefly, I'll start by talking about the scope of this research. When you hear the environmental impacts of fish farming, you might be thinking of all manner of things, and I like to show this diagram here because it is a nice overview of some of those environmental impacts. It's not an exhaustive one, but if you are in Scotland, for instance, you might see the sewage, the waste that comes downstream from these fish farms. You might be familiar with the escape of introduced species, the viruses that are transmit to the wild populations, or you have questions about antibiotic use and things like that, or predator targeting, which is also interesting and controversial issue. I will do my best if you have questions on those to field them at the end, but the scope of this research and this talk focuses very succinctly on this use of wild fish to make meal and oil for the feed that goes into these farms, as well as something that's not on this diagram, which is the use of crops to manufacture that feed as well. So we're talking about the upstream impacts of manufacturing the feed. And in order to do that, I need to explain something to you called fish in, fish out. So this is a ratio that's been used historically in scientific literature as sort of a proxy for the environmental impact of fish farming. And it's not comprehensive or necessarily a good proxy for the environmental impact because it's not complete. And we'll talk about why, but it's still informative for a lot of reasons. So what we're doing here is effectively reconstructing what we call a live weight equivalent of the wild fish that would be caught to make the feed that go into these fish farms, and taking that as a ratio of the food that is produced downstream or as an output. So the reason that this is important is because there is a lot of research over the last couple decades that has shown that this ratio of fish in to fish out, which is a biomass ratio, just to clarify, it's not the number of fish, but the biomass, has decreased over time. And this is commonly referenced as a reason that fish farming is becoming more sustainable. So if you look at this research published by, this is a graph by Our World in Data, but it's based on research published in 2021 by Rosamund Naylor and her colleagues in Nature, and it shows that over the last 20 years, if you look at this bottom row here, you can see that this ratio has decreased from almost 2 to nearly a quarter. So that's a decrease in the ratio of fish in to fish out by it's almost 1/7 of what it was 20 years ago, 85%. So that's a huge gap in that if you were only looking at the use of wild fish, this would seem sustainable and this would seem like a good trend, but it's not the full story. And we're going to talk about why for a couple reasons. So the first is what actually goes into calculating this fish in quotient. And I won't get into the math here, but this is essentially the original formula that was used in this paper I just talked about. And the lower formula is ours. You can see it's a little bit longer. There are some other things that were not really, they're sources of wild fish that have not historically been accounted for. And the bottom line here is that it's a little bit more complicated than it sounds. We need to look at the components of the feed. We need to look at what industries they're going to. We need to look at the conversion ratios that are used in each sector. We need to look at the efficiency of grinding up these wild fish into paste or into oil, and what's used in different sectors of the aquaculture industry. And the second reason that we need to look at a little bit of a wider picture to understand the environmental impacts of manufacturing, what we call, or the industry at least calls aquafeed here, is that when we're looking at this fish in metric, this is actually only a small sliver of what actually is used to make fish feed. So these blue wedges show the amount of the feed that's made from marine sources, so fish meal or fish oil. And then the orange shows the terrestrial components of the feed, which is mostly crops. And you can see that's the vast majority. And what we're looking at here are 4 different scenarios. So the one used by Naylor and colleagues is in the top left here. And you can see that actually estimates the smallest component of fish meal and oil in the food. And this is based off of surveys given by the FAO to aquaculture producers. They're voluntarily returned. So there's potential for underreporting here, but there's a number of other sources that we were able to find in the peer-reviewed literature on the components of the feed. And so this FAO scenario is another projection made by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. The NBA scenario is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch reports. And this Palo scenario is another one made by a different group of researchers in Sweden. And the reason it's the biggest in this graph is not necessarily to say that it's the most accurate, but it's the only one that we found that broke down the terrestrial component. And we used this to calculate some of the terrestrial impacts of manufacturing aquaculture feed, which we'll come back around to. So on to our results. Effectively, what we're looking at here with the different bars are these different scenarios. And then the second 2, or the first 2 on the left, excuse me, are the Naylor scenario exactly reconstructed as was in their study, and then using that second formula I showed you earlier. So the difference between these dark blue bars, if you can see my mouse here, is when we adjusted for the what's called the reduction efficiency, the processing losses in the factories, and this actually swung in the industry's favor a little bit. We found that it was perhaps using less feed than we thought, but it did rely on the year. There were a lot of sardines in this study year, which there's more oil in them, and that affects the ratio. But when we added in all of these other impacts, like the trimming, so I can just go over those briefly. So this light blue bar shows the things that have been left out of this accounting historically. And one of the big ones is what are called trimmings. And these come from wild fisheries. So it could be the heads or the tails or anything that's not the fish fillet of, maybe it's a halibut that gets made into fish sticks or something. It's still wild fish biomass that's going into the system, but it has sort of been laundered as byproducts in these calculations. And then another one, a big component of these light blue subsections of the columns is what the industry classifies as trash fish. And trash fish refers to species that would otherwise have been, or historically have been, considered bycatch or collateral catch of non-target species, but the aquaculture industry has begun buying off of these fisheries. And in this way, sort of institutionalizing and incentivizing the targeting of these species that were not traditionally targeted by these fisheries, and so expanding their scope. So when we look at the, as you saw in the pie charts, the difference between some of these scenarios is actually quite small. It's maybe this one, it's roughly 1% oil and 1% more oil and 1% more meal. We can see between these, that's almost a third more wild fish. That means, so a small discrepancy or uncertainty, and these self-disclosed metrics in terms of what the feed is made of has a huge ramifications for the amount of wild fish being extracted from the ocean. But you might still be looking at these numbers on the left and saying, well, it still looks like most of them are below 1, right? So less fish, are being pulled out of the ocean than are being farmed. And that is true across the industry, but the reason this might be a little bit misleading or not as relevant to us is that this is dominated by the aquaculture industry in general is dominated by carp farming in China. And a lot of these carp farms are actually not fed at all. You can imagine sort of like a koi pond where fish are swimming around, sort of eating algae and insects. And some of them are fed, but they don't require, they're not carnivorous fish, so they don't require as much fish in the diet. But if we look at the salmon sector specifically, which might be a little bit more relevant to our audience, we can see that the carnivorous species that need a high proportion of oil in the diet, that's a dark red part of these bars. This increases the reliance on these farming methods on the wild fish catch tremendously. And if you look across our feed composition scenarios, the amount of wild fish biomass that has to be extracted to make an equivalent amount of salmon can be twice or up to 6 times that amount of salmon, or I'm sorry, the amount of these what we call small pelagic fish that are extracted from the ocean and reduced into feed. And this can be over, you know, if we balance this by their biomass of the actual fish, we're talking about potentially over 1,000 anchovies to farm a single Atlantic salmon. And there's an extra part of this graphic as well, which is the hatched portion, which is the collateral catch. And that refers to the bycatch and also this phenomenon called slipping, which is sort of like a high grading practice that happens in these reduction fisheries. It has a very high mortality rate, but it escapes the accounting of bycatch because they're never actually pulled onto the deck. So if you're really curious, you can look at our supplementary materials and see how we calculated the slipping mortality across the reduction fishing industry. So we can see between the last two graphs, there's sort of a trade-off between farming these herbivorous fish and these carnivorous fish. And of course, these are loose categories, you know, often, you know, these herbivorous carp and tilapia, they still eat, you know, small crustaceans and things in the wild, but the feed is primarily herbivorous. But, you know, it might seem like that would be a solution to move away from this heavily fish extraction reliant sectors like salmon and trout toward these sectors that rely less on fishing like carp and tilapia. But this doesn't solve the problem as much as shift the impact from marine to terrestrial systems. So we're talking about replacing that fish meal with components like soy meal. So this is effectively, in a theoretical case, shifting the burden from a marine ecosystem like the Humboldt Current, where these anchovies live, to a terrestrial one like the Amazon, which is a major source of soy farming. So we're talking about a trade-off here, and you can see how the different sectors of the fish farming and crustacean farming industries sort of fall up here. Nothing really ends up in this low impact score on both axes. And the implications of this impact of the crops used for aquaculture, animal aquaculture, I should say, are actually huge. And this is what's a big part of what's left out of the conversation. So when we're talking about the decreasing use or the decreasing proportion of fish components in aquaculture feed, often this is sort of described as a story of decoupling outputs from inputs. But if we actually compare the production, that's the blue lines here, to the increase in the amount of crops required to farm each of these sectors' output, and this is based on that sort of optimistic Naylor et al. Scenario. The flip side of this research or these calculations is, of course, that the crops in to fish out ratio is increasing at a rate in most sectors, almost all of them, that's far exceeding the rate of production by the aquaculture sector. And so this, of course, has ramifications for food security. And the reason this is important is that there is a lot of policy discussion going on right now in places like the UN, the World Economic Forum, about how to feed a growing world and a planet facing ecological crisis. And there's a lot of hype around aquaculture as a solution, or blue food economies, right? And it's mostly based on this idea that the aquaculture industry is becoming more sustainable and solving some of these sustainability challenges. But again, it's not really the complete story. So that these graphs sort of sum up our research, but going forward in the presentation, I'll just put it in a context that might help you to understand some of the policy discussion and some of the things you'll hear about aquaculture and why that's not really the whole truth. So one of the main advertising or talking points that you'll hear from industry groups like this one by the Global Salmon Initiative is about the efficiency of farming fish and the feed conversion ratio specifically. So you'll see this feed conversion ratio charted next to these other animal farming systems. And it appears that fish farming is incredibly efficient, but this is misleading because this calculation takes a dried mass of feed over a wet mass of output fish. And when we put these on an equal playing field, like Gillian Fry and her colleagues did in this paper from 2018, looking at the retention of calories or nutrients like protein, we can actually see that the aquaculture industry, among all its sectors, falls pretty much in the range of these other animal farming systems. And this, of course, logically follows the ecological laws of trophic assimilation and what we call the 10% rule in ecology, which is that roughly 10% of energy ingested in a certain trophic level makes its way to the next one, and the rest is waste. And you can see that the aggregate across the industry for calorie retention in aquaculture falls right at that 10% mark, which is not a rule, but it's interesting that that this calorie retention calculation confirms that that loose mantra. The next sort of myth that I want to talk about is this idea that fish farming is taking pressure off of wild fish populations. So we'll often see the production of aquaculture reported by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, charted next to the global fisheries catch, also taken by the FAO. And you can see that aquaculture keeps rising while capture fisheries are beginning to stagnate or even decrease. And this looks good on its face. It does look like a sort of decoupling scenario here. But again, this is misleading for a couple reasons. One of these is that the blue line here includes all of the seaweed. And that's a huge part of the aquaculture industry, but it's not necessarily comparable to capture fisheries on the same, over the same denominator. But we can actually look, the real reason that it's misleading is we can actually look very closely at the pressure on wild fish populations in a metric that we call fishing effort, which is basically used by calculating the number of hours spent by all the world's global fishing fleet at sea. And this paper is around 10 years old, but this orange line continues to rise even as the catch stagnates. So what this means is that we are spending more time at sea, going further out to try to catch the same amount of fish. So the pressure on wild fish populations is continuing to increase, and it's actually also shifting in a large part because of aquaculture toward these reduction fisheries. So as these larger predatory fish that are maybe more marketable, like tuna, salmon, and cod, become more scarce around the world, fishing fleets have changed their methods and their gear to target these oceanic schooling fish like anchovies and sardines, which are used, which we call reduction fisheries, which are used to feed these farms to make those fish that we used to catch. And these reduction fisheries account for roughly around a fifth of the global catch, on average up to a third in some years. So it's a huge proportion of the global fish catch. And if it weren't for aquaculture, the purple line here of the global fish catch would actually be quite a bit lower. And the last talking point that I want here is maybe the more broad one about how fish farming is feeding the world, it's combating food insecurity. And this is a big reason why we need to invest subsidies at the government level into ramping up aquaculture to make sure that people don't go hungry. And of course, hunger is an incredibly important issue, and it's a tragedy and something we need to address. And if we look at these projections here by the World Resources Institute, and I want to just briefly say, all of these organizations, our World in Data, World Resources Institute, are in many respects very excellent sources of information. But on the fish farming topic, I think this is an instance where the scientific community has not really seen the entire story. So we're sort of pushing back on some of these narratives that we think are incomplete. And this one, I think, is particularly incomplete. So we can look at this projection, which looks very optimistic in terms of the millions of tons that will be produced by farming fish in the future. And the capture fisheries seem to be declining. But when we look at the global system of fish trade, and we look at the countries who are suffering the most from hunger, we can see that these are the ones where nutrients are being extracted and they're actually moving toward the global north. And a large part of this is because of reduction fishing for aquaculture. So we can see this most acutely here in the West African region, which has in the last decade or so become a huge target for foreign fishing fleets, which invade the territorial waters, in many cases illegally, of these countries like Ghana, Senegal, and Liberia, and catch these anchovies, which historically have been the food source for subsistence fishing villages, and use them to farm salmon in places like Norway, Chile, and the United States to sell to people that are not suffering from hunger in the same way. And this has actually increased the malnutrition in places like West Africa, like Southeast Asia, like Peru, where with the anchoveta fishery, the biggest reduction fishery in the world is. And the picture looks a lot more complicated when we look at the trade and where the nutrients are flowing. And when we understand this dynamic, it's much harder to believe that fish farming is feeding the world, and it's actually, frankly, is starving people in many regions. So just to sort of round it out, I'm often asked when I talk about this topic, so what are we supposed to eat here? You're saying that farming the carnivorous species is bad, the herbivorous species is bad, catching the fish from the ocean is bad. What are we supposed to do? Well, the good news is that there are much more sustainable solutions. The bad news maybe is that the answer is the one that's staring us in the face, and it's maybe the one that we don't like to talk about. But of course, we can eat plants, and we can feed a growing world with plant-based agriculture with a fraction of the environmental impacts, both upstream and the pollution impacts downstream, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or the water pollution coming out of these fish farms. So this is just a little example, a rough calculation. This is a delicious inari pocket, tofu inari pocket. I'm not supposed to promote companies in this presentation, but I'm just attributing this image to my friend John, who has a little vegan sushi pop-up called Fish Are Friends in Miami. And if we're going to calculate where it would fall on this graph, obviously there's no fish extraction impact. And when we look at that fry paper talking about the caloric retention of these fish farms, it's something like a tenth of the land use impact just to eat these crops directly rather than to funnel them through this animal agriculture system, which just has inherent inefficiencies in terms of the calories and the nutrients lost, but also in the waste that's created downstream, which creates a whole host of environmental impacts, which we're suffering from all over the world. So I think it's really important to contextualize all of these factors. And also, I just want to talk about, just briefly, I like to end on this image of an anchovy or a school of anchovies, which I think is really fascinating. Most of us that have not seen an anchovy alive very often, but they're incredibly cool and underrated animals. They filter feed like this, just like a whale shark, and very similar to a whale. And collectively, the anchovies and the sardines and the whiting in the world have vastly greater impact on our ecological function and our climate than the great whales even. So I think it's really important to sort of recapture some of that magic of recognizing these species and these animals as ecological actors and as individuals. So here's our study cited. You can just drop "feeding global aquaculture" into a search engine. It should pop up. It's open access if you want to read the whole thing. And these are my social media tags if you want to follow me there. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Spencer. We really appreciate this talk. It's been very informative. And now, any questions? Let's see. Spencer, do you think you'll be needing your slides to illustrate anything, or can we just get back to the previous?
If I do, I can just share again.
Okay, sure.